is 9292. That's 9292. Okay. So a couple of quick housekeeping matters. I sent out some emails to those of you who are already way over, and maybe some of these people have dropped the course, but if you've missed more than 5 classes, that's already a fatal event. So, you know, I think I've emailed anybody for whom that's true. But please be mindful that even if you get to 4 absences, your grade will drop a letter grade. So please be mindful of that, and it's a really avoidable problem. Come to class, simple. Also, I answered a question from a few of you about the final project, and that needs to be done individually, not in groups. So each of you needs to do the PowerPoint presentation according to the terms laid out in the assignment. And I believe that is due on December 1st, correct? Yes, December 1st. And so I'll then have some, I think that weekend, to go through the PowerPoints and select which ones will have the opportunity to present in the penultimate class. So that ought to be fun. So, any other questions about operations of the class at this point? Yeah. I'm afraid not. We've had all the extra credit we're going to have. Okay. Well, but you did the extra credit, I assume, if you missed a quiz, because that would be the smart thing to do. So then you've made up half of it, which seems to me a reasonable thing. Okay, come on. And those of you who are just getting here, the code is 9292. So please come on in and get seated. Okay, so as you can see, we have a slightly different format today. We're going to do the whole thing from the table. And I'm delighted to welcome today's guest. Julie Burros is Chief of Arts and Culture for the City of Boston, a cabinet-level position reporting directly to Mayor Martin J. Walsh. The Arts Cabinet includes the Boston Public Library and the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture. As department head for the very multifaceted MOAC, she leads Boston Creates, the cultural plan for Boston, the Boston Cultural Council, which makes grants to artists and organizations, and the Boston Art Commission, which commissions and approves public art. Other programs include art exhibitions at City Hall, the Poet Laureate Program, and operation of the historic Strand Theater. Burros trained as an urban planner and is a 20-year veteran of municipal government public service. Prior to moving to Boston in late 2014, she served as the Director of Cultural Planning for my hometown, our hometown, the City of Chicago, in their Department of Cultural Affairs since 2000. Please join me in welcoming Julie Burros. Now,
thanks so much, George.
Of course, my
While we tee up the PowerPoint, I would love to ask the class, by show of hands, a little bit about like what you're studying. So maybe, what is it? Is it architecture students? Raise your hand, just a couple.
Right.
Any urban planners here? No. What else? Fine arts majors or performing arts majors? What else do we have? Economics.
There we go.
Couple.
How about business?
Business. Few people. Government, maybe. Huh. All right. Did I miss stuff?
Yes. How about engineering?
Oh,
Allora.
cool.
Allora.
All right.
The mother lode.
Excellent. My dad was a mechanical engineer, and I do consider myself a little bit of a gearhead, so I'm feeling it, engineering peeps. Great.
So you can
okay.
just forward.
Oh, okay. So this is the very last slide.
Sorry about that. You're
Can
right.
you see it?
They can.
A word about most of the photos in this whole entire thing. Oh, you're going to get a preview.
Sorry, no, but it's going to go so fast. It's just going to be like.
It's going to give you fits. Okay, that's the beginning. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do and the project that I'm working on that sort of ties together all the work that I do. And then we'll leave time for discussion, Charlie Rose style, as you're probably used to, and then plenty of time for questions and answers. So Boston Creates, that is the first ever cultural plan for the city of Boston. I actually headed up the creation of a cultural plan in Chicago. And came here just about 2 years ago to head up that effort and to build up the Mayor's Office of Cultural Affairs. Oddly enough, Boston didn't have a Chief of Arts and Culture or Arts Commissioner in over 20 years. So in the prior administration, there were a few arts programs, but very little municipal funding for arts and culture. A little bit surprising for a city the size of Boston and sort of with its reputation for arts and culture. So I came here to build up a department close to the ground up and bring that fresh perspective to Boston. And we know Boston, just because there wasn't an arts commissioner, there wasn't an Office of Arts and Culture, doesn't mean there aren't amazing cultural assets here. And we know Boston has an incredible reputation for being a city that has amazing education infrastructure, as you all know, a real history of innovation and incubating new ideas and startups, revolution, amazing celebrations, and a very, very participatory, culturally engaged population. As a matter of fact, the name Boston Creates really embraces that notion that everybody has the impulse to do something creative, whether it's, building something as a tinkerer in your garage, or quilting with your circle, or singing in a chorus or choir, or engaging in the fine arts at a very, very serious level where you might actually call yourself an artist. So there's this really wide spectrum of people deeply engaging in creative expression. And how do you go about creating a plan for arts and culture? You really start out with community engagement. Boston is a city where communities are deeply engaged in civic dialogue and in the development process, in historic preservation, and sort of the health and welfare of their neighborhoods. And creating a plan for arts and culture is no different. We had a very multifaceted community engagement process that kicked off in June of 2015 and went all the way through the fall. And then after that, we sort of synthesized all this information. So we had a steering committee that was formed, about half city bureaucrat and department people and about half cultural leaders who were very closely held advisors to the process and actually were formed before I even got to Boston. We had a larger kind of a bigger picture, larger group of a leadership council, really leaders in all different sectors, including philanthropy. And one of the ways we structured the community engagement was to recruit really grassroots cultural leaders in neighborhoods and form teams, ask them to co-chair teams and then form community-based teams in that neighborhood. And then they were trained and supported and actually charged with convening the community in their neighborhood. So 16 different neighborhoods: Charlestown, downtown, South End, Rosendale, et cetera, et cetera. Really a kind of a distributed grassroots process that was supported. And those community teams convened over 100 different community conversations in a format and a template where they submitted notes and really talked about the cultural life and the cultural future of the city and sort of what are the challenges, what's the potential. We also fielded, and then we really encouraged youth to be involved in all the community teams. And by youth, I mean sort of high school and younger. And they told us, we'll participate in the other teams, but we want our own team too. Because youth can have conversations with each other that they can't have when there's mostly grown-ups in the room. And this is just sort of a picture of that happening. Along with this qualitative information of dialogues and taking notes and sort of having these engagement exercises, we did field an original survey Over 3,200 people responded, and this was deeply asking people about how they personally engage in arts and culture, and sort of what are those barriers to doing more, what do they want, sort of how do they want to expand their cultural life, and how can the city of Boston support that. We also engaged artists in our process. We had a team of artists who are kind of an artist collective called the Department of Play. And they've actually been involved in several different planning processes. They were involved in the Go Boston 2030 transportation plan, and they bring the perspective of artists. How do you reach artists? How do you talk to artists? And so they not only helped us train the community teams and think about how to engage in dialogue in an inventive, creative way, they then sort of turned around and hired 3 other artist ethnographers who sort of brought this anthropological perspective and this conceptual art perspective, sort of how do you reach people. One of the things that one of those artists did was organize these bread making sessions for artists. One of the things we needed to do in Boston was overcome a lot of skepticism among the arts community. There's been decades of disinvestment and basically neglect of this sector. What makes you think things are going to change right away? Well, sort of having a session designed by and convened by an artist who's trusted and sort of has a lot of social capital in the community is a different kind of dialogue than if the official from City Hall comes and sort of speaks at you. And they devise these bread making sessions because perhaps you know that when you're physically engaged with an activity, your brain works differently, right? So no accident that you probably, I know I have all my best ideas when I'm in the shower doing this, literally shaking the good ideas loose from my head. So this seems to have this power of unlocking different kinds of thinking, different kinds of dialogue. So just an example of how we approach this different from you would any other kind of a city plan. And we learned a lot about what Boston looks like. For me, being new to Boston, really, really helpful exercise in getting to know the city and getting to know the unique challenges in the arts sector. And we heard a lot about silos and barriers. And the silos are very multifaceted. Actually, let me get a show of hands. How many of you are from Boston? Ooh, small percentage. I would say less than 10%. So many of you are not from Boston. And you'll probably know that there are pretty dramatic geographic divides in the city of Boston. You know, Charlestown may as well be another town. It's surrounded by other towns, not physically contiguously connected to Boston. Many of the parts of Boston historically were different cities that were kind of amalgamated in. Alston is sort of separated by this thin little landmass. So very geographically divided, rivers, bridges. Lots of people don't fluidly travel from one neighborhood to the other for anything, let alone for doing arts and culture. We also found there was all kinds of silos between different arts disciplines, between the arts and other sectors. And that people experience, again, very multifaceted barriers that prevent them from engaging more fully in the cultural life of the city. For youth, it's very different than for millennials or people with young children. For youth in particular, public safety is a big issue that might not be for other people. A lot of barriers actually for people with disabilities, not only physical barriers, but a real paucity of cultural experiences that are audio described or autism spectrum friendly or hearing impaired described. So really, really multifaceted barriers. And we learned a lot about what we need to do to address those barriers. One of them is to expand equity and opportunity to engage in culture. Lots of cultural assets not equitably distributed all throughout the city. lots of arts education, again, not equitably distributed throughout all schools and all grades. And there's more and more arts in the schools, and there's definitely opportunities for youth to engage in out-of-school time cultural opportunities, but again, really in only certain parts of the city, in East Boston, where this amazing arts education program for youth out of school called Zoomix exists. They have a 4-year waiting list for kids to get into their music program. I mean, by the time you get in, you're out of school already. So real pinches in terms of capacity and opportunity. We know in a city like Boston, which is almost thoroughly gentrified and enormously expensive, that there's a real shortage of cultural spaces and facilities, especially that are available on an affordable basis. We know that access to information is super challenging, despite the fact that most people have smartphones and most people have internet access, and there are hundreds of websites and sources for getting information about the arts. It's still really hard to cut through the noise and understand what's happening. People find out about what's happening after it's already happened and it's done. Especially in Boston, where the run of a show might be just one and done, or one weekend or 2 weekends. You don't have sort of the benefit of having a 5 or 6 week run where you can get word of mouth and find out about, I need to go see this thing. And then there's a real shortage of financial support. Boston is among the very lowest in municipal per capita dollar support for arts and culture. This is a kind of a structural, historic fact. We were lucky enough during the process that the Boston Foundation did some research on comparative levels of municipal support for arts and culture, and very low municipal support historically. In the new Mayor Walsh administration, that number has grown tremendously, but we're still far short of how we would benchmark ourselves with peer cities. And so we took all this information and boiled it down into 5 key goals that really are the key content of the cultural plan, the Boston Creates plan. And I'll go into those in some detail. And by the way, most of the photography in this presentation is the work of one of the artist ethnographers who the Department of Play hired to be part of the process, a photographer called Leonardo March. And so these incredible photographs really document the less picture postcard, well-known aspects of the cultural life of the city. And so goal number 1 is really focused on creating fertile ground for a vibrant arts and culture ecosystem. And we use the word ecosystem very deliberately, acknowledging that there's a deep interconnectedness between the commercial and the nonprofit, the individual and the organization, all of the different creative disciplines. Most people who are serious creative practitioners are hyphenates. They do more than one thing. They have hybrid careers. They have their day gig, they have their side job. So lots of people are doing lots of different things to make a living in something creative. And we know that our historic overdependence on private philanthropy has really inhibited risk-taking and innovation and the creation of new works. That's not good for the ecosystem. Cultural spaces are really pinched. You maybe are aware that there have been several large theaters that they've been threatened with their existence. The Huntington Theater was renting from BU. BU sold the building. The Opera Theater moved out of a building that was getting too expensive. They actually don't have their itinerant, and in different theaters this season, they're looking for space. So even small organizations have had trouble finding and securing space. They'll find a space and then the rent will go up and double, triple, quadruple, and they have to find new space. So really difficult to find space. And small and mid-sized organizations are very squeezed, especially because they're spending so much of their organizational budget on their occupancy costs. And we know that City Hall can do a much better job making the permit process easier, making it easier to find information from this newly formed Department of Arts and Culture. Goal number 2 is about keeping artists in Boston. We do a great job of attracting young people to Boston to go to sort of one of our 60 universities and colleges. We do a much worse job of keeping creative people here in Boston. They find it very difficult to start, in big part because it's so expensive to be a young person and start your career here. So we know that affordable housing is a huge issue, affordable workspaces, artist-live work housing, and individual artists never really got any formal support. Our sort of financial supports for arts and culture were very much focused on the biggest organizations in town. That money had a really hard time flowing to individual artists. Goal number 3 is about cultivating a city where all cultural expressions are respected and resourced, and where culture is much more accessible. Most of you guys aren't from Boston, so you'll know that kind of the narrative of Boston is very much dominated by history and heritage and sort of this really larger-than-life Revolutionary War history. And it's enormously important and exciting, and the Freedom Trail is so well visited, but there's lots of other cultures that have come here and thrived, and many different neighborhoods have seen successive waves of different cultures. I recently learned that Chinatown used to be a Lebanese neighborhood, and there's no trace of that left. And Chinatown itself is threatened with development on all sides, and really faces a threat to cultural preservation. So we need to do a much better job of telling all the stories of cultural Boston and ethnic Boston. The population has changed tremendously. It's enormously diverse, but we don't necessarily see that expressed in our cultural institutions. And we know that there are enormous disparities, income disparities, big access disparities among different races, disabilities, and among geographic lines. And we need to do a much better job of reaching across those divides. I think last week sort of just showed us in really dramatic fashion how divided our country and our city really is. And how can we better leverage our city departments, our own sort of resources? You know, we've got 24 different branch libraries. We've got 29 different cultural community centers in the city. Those are a potential distribution network of arts and culture that we could take better advantage of. Goal number 4 is about integrating arts and culture into all aspects of civic life. And that means that we need to do a much better job of incorporating artists in our work in city government. We're doing that by having artists in residence in city departments, which we can maybe discuss when we talk a little bit. We need to be a place where arts education and arts learning is available much more readily citywide, not only for youth, but for people of all ages. And really be intentional about incorporating artists and art creative sort of placemaking into how we're rebuilding and remaking the city, sort of incorporating that into our public realm. Northeastern does a tremendous job of that, I think really recently with all this public art that's been happening on the campus.
The Coltrane concert every year.
Yeah, it's really cool. And goal number 5 is really about partnerships. How do we work across these silos and divides to help each other move these goals forward? Part of the siloization is that people don't collaborate in Boston. They're very competitive, very territorial. It's a little bit culturally ingrained, but we think that arts and culture, most arts disciplines are highly collaborative, and so we can leverage that approach and sort of move forward collectively. So how do we mobilize all of the different sectors to help grow resources for arts and culture? How do we motivate other sectors? A really great example is the healthcare sector. How do we start to talk about our growing crisis of addiction and opiate overdoses? How can arts and culture play a role in recovery, suicide prevention, huge, thorny, difficult public health issues? And that requires partnerships and new ways of thinking about arts and culture. So how do we make this all come together? What kind of Boston are we looking to create because of this cultural plan? We want to really help the city of Boston to be creatively engaged, to help them move forward in their family, their community, their career, help artists survive by having a really strong ecosystem for them. It's not only artists, but entrepreneurs in the creative sector. And that requires an active marketplace, a really fluid place for making sales or finding supporters. How do we have sustainable venues? We've got a lot of larger venues, and people always think, oh, the bigger the organization, the easier they have it. They just have bigger problems, and so it's even harder to solve them. And then how do we have great supportive municipal policies? How do we just help government get out of the way and foster those partnerships and those connections? And then finally, probably the hardest of all is how do we help leverage design thinking, creative problem solving to help us move forward on all kinds of difficult problems, like, our infrastructure is so pinched, mobility is so difficult. It's such an unaffordable city. Climate change is such a pressing problem. Getting creative about problem solving will really help us move forward. In all of this, we think really deeply about what's the role of city government? Does city government take the lead? Are we a catalyst? Are we convening partners? How do we foster collaboration in a city where that isn't the most natural inclination? How do we model the behavior we want to sort of see happen? How do we find partners whose interests are closely aligned and then make that tie very evident? And then, of course, where do you start? What's the most important thing to get going first, second, third? What's a little bit longer range goal that we can lay the groundwork for? So we're starting implementation. Our plan was issued in mid-June of 2016, and we announced some immediate implementation programs with $1 million investment that Mayor Walsh committed. And so we're going to create an artist resource person in my office who will be a friendly, knowledgeable, single point of entry, start here for help. And we can connect you to sort of programs, and we're bringing on that person very shortly. We've started also by making grants to artists. It had never been done. Very few grant programs are available to individual artists. One of our challenges was that our typical grants, there was one deadline a year. If you missed that deadline, you were just out of luck for the whole year. What we did was we pivoted and said, no, there should be opportunities every month. So the Opportunity Fund is a grant for artists that opens up every month. It's kind of a micro grant, but it's been enormously impactful in helping artists gain some resources to share their work with the public. We'll be doing a couple other grant programs. Assets for Artists is really focused on helping artists build their business skills so that they have the assets to invest in their career, whether it's a business or a space or something that they want to launch. We're starting the second round of our experiment of having artists placed in residence in city departments, city government departments. This year, we'll have 10 artists in residence in different community centers, meant to rethink how that center is a resource for that community, how they engage with that community, and then also how do we sort of energize the whole workforce of this city department. And then we'll be launching an alternative spaces pilot. So we've asked lots of people who have spaces that are not used all the time that could be well used for arts and culture. So we'll be releasing a request for proposals for space at the AT&T flagship store in Boylston. That an arts organization can rehearse there once a week for free. Space at Mass Ioneer, not unlike this, big lecture hall that they rarely use. That the hospital's open 24/7, so why not leverage that fact and come up with a kind of a template for partnerships that you could just sort of use the stage for rehearsals, maybe a theater group, a couple times a week, and that helps alleviate the space crunch and bring some kind of new, interesting energy into these institutions who would welcome that kind of creative energy. Another thing we're doing is building a Percent for Art program in city government. And you guys from other places, this might sound a little familiar to you, but in about 26 different states in the US and the federal government and hundreds and hundreds of municipalities, they actually have the practice of, in a municipal construction project, so let's say you're building a new courthouse, a percentage of that capital construction budget is dedicated, set aside for arts and culture, and perhaps it's an artist who is part of the design team for the building, or if it's a renovation project, they're looking at opportunities to incorporate public art, physical, tangible, built public art into the design program. So we'll be building that into the capital plan for the city of Boston. Super exciting. I actually was just reviewing, so we've issued one RFP for a sort of a public works intersection. So for you civil engineers out there, you might encounter this actually, or structural engineers, you might actually encounter this kind of thing in your career, or for those of you who go into construction management, which is like a fascinating career path for engineers, this is something you actually really might encounter, having this multidisciplinary team and figuring out like, how do we build this thing? How do we incorporate this thing? How is our project better because we've got an artist on our design team? So we've issued an RFP for Hyde Square, sort of intersection in JP. I just was reviewing the final draft of a RFP that should go out this week for North Point Park, which is right across from where the Paul Revere House is in the North End. And then we've got several more that we're teeing up for libraries and schools and community centers. And so major new infusion of city dollars in the production of art for Boston. And in the works, we've got an artist survey that we're doing in partnership with NEFA, the New England Foundation for the Arts. I'd encourage you all to take this survey to tell us what your needs are, young creative people who we want to keep in Boston. We need to know sort of where do you want to be, what kind of space do you need, how can we support your career growth. We've got several more cultural spaces that the BPDA now, the former BRA, these are mandated cultural spaces and some new developments in the Seaport that are coming online. And we're doing a study of the needs of the cultural sector in terms of space. We're super exciting that the Boston Housing Authority in the future will have units set aside for artists who qualify for public housing, and then we'll incorporate other cultural spaces and public art in the redevelopment of public housing. And then a little bit further down the line, we'll be understanding sort of what cultural equity looks like in Boston, what the inequities look like, and sort of what the path forward might look like, and then how do we also incorporate creative startups in our economic development efforts. So that is the extremely quick and dirty of what the cultural plan process looks like and what we're moving forward for implementation. And so maybe with that,
Yeah, well, first of all, let's
we can open up
thank
our
Julie
discussion.
for her presentation.
Oh, thanks.
But there's so much here that is so relevant to what we're doing in this
good.
course, and I'm
So
so glad that you're following Gediminas and Nomeda, or Bonus, our Lithuanian guests last time. If I've mispronounced both of their first names and their last names, please don't tell them.
I know those guys. They're amazing. He's amazing.
But,
yeah.
So there's a couple of sort of big picture issues I want to get at right away, because you gave us a lot of detail, which is
A lot of
excellent.
information, yeah.
But one thing that I noticed right away when you were talking about working with partnerships and trying to take advantage of space that is underutilized in important settings right now sounds an awful lot like the sharing economy.
Oh, for sure.
So
Yeah.
we've talked about that in terms, we had, as I said, we had Robin Chase, the founder of Zipcar, was here talking about autonomous vehicles. And in this course over several years, we've had many guests who are part of this revolution in recognizing how many latent assets are going underutilized when we claim to have desperate need of precisely those assets.
Yeah.
So the idea that the city would, I think the single most powerful thing the city could do in a way, in terms of venues, we'll talk about other things later, would be to assemble a kind of list of those places.
Yeah.
And maybe these institutions that have trouble with their pilot, it's a kind of sort of payment in lieu of taxes.
Right.
There's always a little bit of grief from cultural institutions about these payments. Well, this might be exactly a
Yeah.
way to do that. So that seems very innovative to me.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up pilot. Do you guys all know what pilot is, right?
Other than what
Payment-
I just said, I bet nobody
Right.
here knows what it is.
Okay, so payment, it's an acronym for payment in lieu of taxes. Pilot, P-I-L-O-T. So this is, the city of Boston has a huge percentage of its landmass is property tax exempt. So that means universities, hospitals, cultural institutions pay no property tax because they provide a public benefit to the people of Boston. Sometimes the city asks them, well, we know you provide a public benefit, but we want you to make a payment anyway because you're using up so many city resources, you need to kind of offset. So it's this really tough situation. And if you read the cultural plan online, which I highly recommend you read it, it's a quick read, you'll see we talk about Boston's municipal, its constrained municipal finance situation. Municipal finance, fascinating, drives everything. So because so much of Boston's landmass is property tax exempt, Boston doesn't get the same kind of real estate taxes that other cities might. And so has always had a very conservative fiscal approach.
Right.
Careful, 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 watching every penny. And it's also kind of that Yankee thrifty mentality, but there's a real reason in Boston. And it's compounded by the fact that the city of Boston can't just raise taxes willy-nilly. In order for the city of Boston to enact a new tax, let's say like other cities on soda or cigarettes or alcohol or rental cars, they have to petition the state of Massachusetts to levy any new taxes. So that's a heavy political lift. So they're super constrained by the property tax exempt and also by not being able to levy taxes. So the reason why there hasn't been a lot of municipal investment in arts and culture is there isn't a lot of extra money sitting around
Right.
for us to spend on arts and culture. And it's one of the reasons why leveraging the capital construction budget makes a huge amount of sense. But this is a super long-winded answer to tell you a couple things about how city government can do a much better job of leveraging its assets the same way the space pilot is. So a really cool example of, and maybe it's like design thinking and efficiency, this whole network of community centers, 29 community centers, about a third of them are attached to other institutions like schools. So the ones that are attached to schools, they're not open during school hours. They open after school, and it's lots of after school programs. But the centers actually had staff people there when they weren't open. And so they completely reorganized the staffing of all the centers and said, oh, you're not open, you don't need staff there. So just by doing that, not hiring any people, not having any additional staff hours, they were able to reorganize the staff and reformat basically the operating hours. So centers that used to close at 6 o'clock are now open till 9 p.m. And centers that only had limited hours on Saturdays now open Saturdays. They still have really limited operating hours on Sundays. There's 29 community centers that are open on Sundays when actually maybe the community really needs to use them on Sundays. So it's a great step forward in terms of maximizing. If space is our biggest shortage, the city has 29 community centers with a lot of space in them. Okay, that's what interesting. Like let's
so
move, keep
partway
going.
there.
Partway there. Like incremental change is important, and what was important was to be able to achieve that magnitude of change without spending any extra dollars or hiring extra staff.
Sure.
So it's huge.
Oh, that's good. That's
but there
outstanding.
is actually a website for listing your cultural space and finding a cultural space. It's called Mass Space Finder. But, so another one of those issues of information, presumably all the cultural spaces in the whole state of Massachusetts are there. Clearly they're not. Mass Eye and Ear doesn't consider themselves a cultural space, but they could list their space.
Well, this is where you guys
there,
can
right?
reinterpret things.
Leverage that platform. And one of the first things I did, because libraries is part of the arts cabinet, I was like, let's make sure we list every available space in the public library system, screening room, community room, theater. Let's make sure they're listed in Mass Space Finder, because people don't know that they're available for free to have a cultural program in.
Well, I think that's great, using kind of technology, visibility, very low-cost means to take a better advantage of assets you already have. That's certainly super smart. One of the things that strikes me about what you're charged with doing, that is at a much more 30,000-foot level, is, and this relates to the sort of design thinking term about defining the problem. Oftentimes we start working on the solution to something, we're in a hurry, or we think we understand what the problem is, but you have clearly stated two very different problems, and I think you're responsible for both of them. But one of them is supporting artists, individual humans who have need of housing, financial support, maybe resource support of other kinds, to produce their work, to keep a creative class in Boston that may or may not be involved in public art at all. And then the whole issue of curating the public sector. So how many of you have been here in Boston long enough to have seen Janet Eichelman's hanging net, colorful hanging net down on the Greenway? Yes, a few of you. And then also now the third iteration, I think, of the mural on the Vent building on the Greenway. How many of you have seen that?
It's cool.
It's
It just got finished, yeah.
So it's very interesting. So these are two obviously very visible, very central examples of public art, but maybe you could talk to us a little bit about other public art underway in the city and other opportunities, because I can think of a million opportunities for public art, and some of which leverage existing resources in the same way that we were just describing. So I've cited two, the Eichelman piece and then the Vent building. But what else are you guys involved with?
So there's a few different ways to think about public art. First of all, people told us in the cultural plan process they wanted more public art in Boston. They want a beautiful civic realm and public realm. They want inspiring public places. I came here from the city of Chicago, and people would often point to examples of pretty monumental, very visible, amazing public art in Chicago as examples of like, oh, we want that here. And so we're responding to what people told us is a need. And how do you go about doing that? There's a few different things that happen. The city doesn't have to do all of it, but we have to help make it easy for people to do it. So there's a long tradition of community-driven public art in Boston. So that's a community group or an organization. I'm like, well, we want to have, a monument to, the killing fields of Vietnam, and this is like, a monument that's important to the Vietnamese community, and we're going to raise it and whatever. So there's a lot of community-driven public art where it's very difficult for them to find the resources and the place and the space, and they have to go through an approval process that sits in my office, the Boston Art Commission. And it is a notoriously lengthy, thorny, difficult process, which we can make easier by being much more involved in supporting community-driven efforts. And so it's part of what I call cultivating a culture of yes, And in the past, because there were so few resources and so few staff and not a lot of political support for public art, it was more of like, well, if you get everything together, we'll maybe approve it. But instead,
do it all,
instead
we
of
might say
saying
yes.
like, oh, we'll help you make that a reality because it's clearly important here. So it's going from this culture of no to this culture of yes, which requires a huge culture shift in city government. So that's part of is just making it easier to help organizations like the Greenway. So the Rose Kennedy Greenway, which is like a public-private conservancy, and they have a new public art curator from Chicago, by the way. And helping them, the city gave a small grant for the Janet Ockelman piece, but also helped coordinate the closure of streets and ramps, and that was a huge deal. And so just sort of saying, yes, you can close streets, and we'll help you make that a reality as long as you do it on these days, and sort of make it a little easier. Whereas it might have been like, well, hell no, you're not closing street, and what do you mean you're going to close a ramp? And when the streets are here closed all the time for repairs or races or marathon, what have you. So kind of getting to yes is important. And then also, we want to use the light posts, and tap into the lights so that we can put lights. That's city infrastructure. And instead of saying, like, talk to Bureau of Electricity, Bureau of Electricity is like, no, talk to streets. No, talk to instead of, like, that runaround you get from city bureaucracy, just saying, like, we'll help you figure out how to get to yes within city. Just sort of that extra mile. And then kind of similarly, so it's resources, it's collaboration, but it's very much of a mindset of saying we value public art. It's a stated value of the people. It's a stated value of this administration. So we put our money where our mouth is and help you make it happen because you've told us that you want this. And in the same way with artists, Boston values its image as like this thriving, the mayor has this phrase of thriving, healthy, innovative. And I really believe that you don't have innovation unless you have creativity. You don't have creativity unless you have artists. You don't have artists unless you have support for artists. I mean, most artists who work at a very serious high level still have a day job and probably don't make much money from their creative practice until they're pretty far along in their career, no matter what discipline or genre they're in. And so they've got this like sometimes decades-long R&D process of creating their creative product. They're not going to get they're not going to be able to monetize that for a really long time. So how you support that is really complicated.
Right. When I had the good fortune to, how many of those of you in class have been to Berlin, Germany? Look at that, okay. Did any of you happen to be there, when was it, I guess 2014, in 2014? No, yes, yeah. So 2014 was the 25th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down.
Wow.
And one of the most interesting public art interventions, most meaningful that I've ever seen, was they, and of course this is a strong municipal government, has a big investment
Lots
in
of funding for
public art.
5 opera companies in the city of in Berlin.
I can just imagine the conversation at a bar that involves dissing 4 of them and expressing your love for the one that you like. But they had traced the footprint of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
It has all been. You can't tell where it was now because there's been so much development has happened. But they trace it and they put helium-filled balloons with lights in them all along the route, so that, especially at night, the shape and reality of the wall was back, however ephemerally. And then they had had events where you could walk, and I walked with thousands of people along the route of the Berlin Wall. It was really quite powerful.
Yeah.
It seems to me that Boston has, it does have the Freedom Trail, of course.
Right.
And I share your sense, maybe this is the Chicagoan in both of us, that okay, history is great and we need to pay attention to it, but it cannot be the only thing.
Right.
21st century Boston has a number of really interesting things about it. It seems to me there's a number of narratives that are possible to talk about.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting if the city, and maybe because of the physical nature of Boston, it maybe needs to be the city in collaboration with Cambridge and Somerville and Brookline and Chelsea and Everett, et cetera, to come up with some kind of regional things, because they would speak to the city so powerfully, I think.
Yeah.
Have you guys talked
So
about that?
you've hit on a few things. So one of the really interesting decisions that the Rose Kennedy Greenway made was to mostly stick with temporary and contemporary public art. Because if you think about the physicality of Boston, it's one of the few 21st century large public spaces in Boston. Most everything else is like a 17th century public space. So our public spaces have, hundreds of years of history on them. The Rose Kennedy Greenway doesn't. It's 5 years old. It's 21st century. So they've embraced this completely different approach to public art, but also sort of said, we're going to do large-scale public art, and said, oh, this is, and you start to think about, and I think it's because it's a new public space that needs to claim an identity and needs to train people that it's there, and then that those former spaces, so most of you guys don't know it from before, but it was like a double-decker highway that divided up parts of Boston and really was a terrible physical barrier, ugly, dirty, loud, dangerous, everything. And so all the spaces around it are completely reborn and transformed. And part of the role of public art in those spaces is to help people rediscover a completely transformed public space and to transform people's experience in those spaces. And I think it's worth talking about and exploring what's the role of public art. And I think there have been some just amazing examples of commemoration through temporary public art interventions like the one you're describing in Berlin. And we have a lot of commemorative pieces of public art in Boston. The Sojourner Truth and the Irish famine and, the regiments and, lots and lots of history manifest in 3 dimensions. But there are 21st century things that are happening and something thinking about like the marathon bombings and how to commemorate that and memorialize it in a 21st century way, not a 19th or 18th century way. And one of my favorite pieces of public art as commemoration, and maybe you saw it or maybe you guys saw pictures of it in London, it was the centennial of the beginning of World War I. And these were these red poppies, individual sort of glass flowers on kind of like a stalk that were inserted in the Tower of London in sort of the moat. So it actually looks like a river of blood is pouring out of the Tower of London and filling the moat with blood. But it's a poppy, which is actually a symbol of the veterans of the armistice. And each poppy actually stood for a person, so you could actually, give a donation and like, my great uncle Floyd, died in the war, and this is the poppy that commemorates him. And it was temporary, but it was this huge monumental thing commemorating something 100 years later, sort of in this, I thought it was amazing example of big, bold, but also small scale and intimate and temporary, but then it traveled around different parts of the UK, and all the little towns already had a World War I monument, and so it was sort of a fresh look at this, but it was a little bit like the balloons and sort of how do you help people, how do you attach meaning to places, and how do you sort of foreground meaningful episodes in history or contemporary life in a way that isn't so literal and isn't depressing, but is uplifting and celebratory and inspiring and moving and sort of hits all those things that people want from public spaces.
Right. It's interesting. You mentioned the marathon bombing, and we had Eric Howler, who's one of the 2 designers of the memorial to the policeman at MIT who was killed.
Oh, yeah.
But I also gave mostly we interview guests, but I gave a little talk on the evolution of memorials and monuments from being static objects of veneration to being much more experiential now.
Yeah.
Which leads me to the point about, you know, it seems in a way the only significant public art that we can agree on in this age, in America anyway, or in this town, is that of memorial. In other words, the only thing that brings us together enough is perhaps tragedy that we all feel. Like, so for example, everybody, regardless of sort of where you were from, if you were in Boston when that happened, you were very, very, very aware of it. Everybody sheltered in place and so forth, and that whole experience. But, you know, it sort of skips by another opportunity that is much more forward-looking and much more celebratory, that isn't about memorializing, you know, the dead, which we of course certainly should, but also looking forward. I think about, you know, the art of the exhibition of the world expositions, the Eiffel Tower, things that looked forward, and it seems like Boston has dipped its toe in the water in the ever so slightest way. A couple of examples. When coming in the Massachusetts Turnpike 5, 8, maybe even 10 years ago, I think the state, rather than the city, the state started painting all of the undersides of the bridges that you passed underneath these primary colors. And it went from just being the detritus of, the rusty detritus of aging bridges to a kind of a intentional visual sequence. It didn't mean anything. It wasn't about anything. It just took something that used to be background and made it foreground.
Yeah.
When you go to, if you take 95 to Providence, Rhode Island, not a rich city, I assure you. When you enter Providence, it has a bunch of concrete retaining walls in the trench that is I-95. And they just, you know, maybe this is a way to avoid graffiti, but they painted this beautiful perspectival scene that isn't anything like the side of a highway. It's kind of the pastoral views of South Rhode Island waterfront. And it's really quite transformative. And I guess I see the opportunity in transportation infrastructure, in so many surfaces, that would be a really interesting way to kind of change the reading of parts of the city.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of roles public art can play, right? Beautification, transformation, memorial, you know, sometimes it can be functional. There's just a lot of different roles. And I think that's what's so exciting about, for us, being able to incorporate public art in the design of public works and sort of how the city is going about building its public buildings. And so it can be about, you know, the design of a building or riffing on its history or its public role. It'll be really interesting to see what people come up with for North Square, this public park, and this sort of been interpreted in a very literal maritime fashion with like big cobblestones and chains, and how that might transform. I'm not familiar with the examples that you're citing, but one of the things a lot of cities have been doing is working with lighting to transform public spaces and to not only make them beautiful, but make them safer for both pedestrians and for driving, but then also to sort of transmit this image of the city. So City Hall just did a whole renovation of its lights. And part of it was to make City Hall Plaza safer, but it's also to use City Hall itself as like a piece of nonverbal communication, you know, in sort of red, white, and blue, or for red, or pink for breast cancer awareness, or sort of all these different, you know, or solidarity with France when something happens in France. So it's, but it's also actually LED bulbs, so that it's much more energy efficient as well. So that we're talking about a public works project that is, you know, energy efficient, saving money, public safety, and commemorative, and beautiful, and celebratory. Like, it's sort of multifaceted, many layers, and that's always the best kind of public art project, where you achieve multiple goals through one program.
You know, the whole idea, and this is a great theme, the whole idea of layers in a city like Boston, because it is such a historic city. How do you overlay new meanings without, you know, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, the way American cities went about remaking themselves was to bulldoze everything that was there and then rebuild it all completely different. And,
Yeah.
and this kind of, if I could interject, kind of this utopian way of thinking, which says that not only, well, it really says now is the premier moment in history. Everything that came before us is of lesser value, and by the way, everything that will come after us is of
Yeah.
lesser value. And so this idea of layering, I think, is very powerful because it rejects that idea.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, sort of my city planning background, urban renewal, the lessons of, and this happened, every city you're from, except for maybe Providence, but cities not only in the US, but all over the world engaged in some kind of, some form of urban renewal. And it's so interesting, sort of, there are these waves of building. I was really, that are sort of on 50-year cycles, because it's kind of the useful life of a building, kind of, in the modern age. But it is interesting, how much people lament the tearing up of the West End in the 50s and 60s, and slum clearance in other cities, and sort of the highways, and with the dismantling of the central artery, already, you're erasing the projects of urban renewal and sort of bringing back urbanism, and that's happening in Charlestown. And you'll see this again and again with sort of modernist developments now 50, 60, 70 years later, reaching the end of their useful life, getting kind of rebuilt in our 21st century notion of what's the right way to build cities, which, who knows, in 60 years, you guys, as elders might be like, oh my God, how did we think that was right? So there's these successive waves of, in Chicago, there was, in Chicago, there's Carl Sandburg, this poet, is very famous, build the city up, tear the city down, build the city up again. And it's been happening for millennia, right? So when, ancient people would conquer a city, they would just tear down the most important cultural symbols and build their new thing right on top of it. It's been happening for a really long time. And then when things go full circle, they're now trying to figure out in East Berlin or the former East Germany or parts of Soviet Republic, like do we preserve those architectural symbols of fascism, which were sort of examples of modernism at the time? Do we preserve them to not erase that happened, or do we tear them down and bring back something else, or bring back something new? And it's a really interesting question.
Or do we, as a good friend of mine wrote after the Charleston, South Carolina shootings in the church last year, you all are aware of that? A young man in South Carolina killed 9 black churchgoers in a church in South Carolina, and it fostered a tremendous conversation about Confederate or Civil War era monuments in the South, because the South is filled with monuments to the defeated South and its leaders. And so there was a debate, well, what should we do? Should we go in and tear down these monuments? And I thought my friend, who is from South Carolina, but a very forward-looking chap, I thought he wrote the best bit, which was, no, we shouldn't tear them down. The world should know that this happened, absolutely. But we should add layers to these monuments. We should add text. We should build around them. We should recontextualize them. In other words, we should provide a new layer of meaning to these things so that history is legible to people after we're gone. I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, and there's also like a real need to interpret those forgotten histories. And I think Boston actually, in some places does an okay job of it. And to talk about, and people now, when we talk about cultural equity, I mean, that's what we talk about, is telling everybody's stories, not just some stories from some parts of history. So, to let people know that like free black people lived in the North End, or enslaved people lived, at Harvard, or sort of what is the real truth of what happened here, not just this kind of whitewashed version. And the other thing that we don't do that well at all is to tell the story of the massacred native populations. But then also to tell like the 21st century, like this photo here, this is from a Caribbean carnival. There's a ton of Caribbean culture, tons of Caribbean immigrants to Boston, and having, sort of lifting up abilities for them to express their culture that is a new culture for Boston, perhaps, or newish. So there's a lot of really important layers and meanings here, and and who tells what story? Are white people allowed to tell the story of enslaved black people or massacred native populations? Like, that doesn't really sit well with a lot of people. So, empowering who gets to tell what story is also a really, really contentious cultural ground.
This is where your job is so much more complicated than the job of most people who do what I do professionally, which is to work as an architect for a private client. These issues are less complex, so I'm sympathetic to that. I have a ton more questions I could ask you, but I think I'd like to ask the students if you guys have any questions for Julie about the cultural and artistic life of our city. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so the question was, how do we work with universities to achieve our goals? It's really multifaceted. In our cultural plan process, we engaged the universities in a lot of discussions about this. And one of the more striking things that happened was the universities told us, oh, we don't actually ever all sit in a room together on a regular basis. Right. So the universities are pretty siloed. Some of the universities deliberately collaborate. So there's like the 7 colleges of the Fenway, which share healthcare and technology and sort of really deeply collaborate, which I think is really unique. There's nothing like it in the Midwest that I've ever heard of. And there's also the Pro Arts Consortium. The Pro Arts Consortium is all the professional art schools. It's Mass Art, the Boston Architectural College, Berkeley, New England Conservatory, Emerson.
Leslie?
No, not Leslie. I don't know. So there's, the art schools, not Northeastern. And they collaborated to actually start a high school for the arts. And so they, several years ago, collaborated with the city. It's Boston Arts Academy, and it's terrific. And
right
it was
across from Fenway Park.
Yeah, right by Fenway Park, and it was deliberately formed to what's the pipeline of local Boston kids coming to those schools, right? It's pretty small. So that's a really great kind of historic example of how the city has collaborated with universities, and we're actively looking to understand how to collaborate more deeply. On the last slide where I talked about implementation, the economic development workforce training is going to be a collaboration with Emerson, who are really looking to understand how young people who aren't necessarily local four-year college directed could maybe take advantage of some of the training that Emerson has to kind of be a really great pipeline. So we're still exploring that. But then there's just basic collaboration, like the Harvard Art Museum saying, we have this giant piece of artwork which is temporary, and when it comes down from this installation, do you have ideas of where else it could go? And it's like, oh, hell yeah. City Hall would be awesome. So there's some opportunistic things like that that are maybe one-off, but yeah, we're still looking into that and sort of understanding what that looks like. Harvard also did a really cool thing in Alston with their Harvard Ed portal, which is part of their public benefits agreement to have this space, really a community space, that leverages like educational and cultural tools of Harvard for the benefit of the local community. That's a really awesome thing that I think is maybe a model for other schools and universities to have deeper ties with their communities. So we're investigating that. It's not an obvious, it's real different for every school.
And it's very different in Boston than it is almost every other city, because the proportion of universities
so many
to the population in
Crazy.
general is so much bigger here. Like there's so many more, like even in other big cities, there's often, one dominant university. And I mean, let's say, so Philadelphia, it has Temple, It has Villanova, but it has University of
Penn,
Pennsylvania
yeah.
is the big dog.
Yeah.
And
In Pittsburgh, it's like CMU. Pitt is much smaller. Yeah. I mean, there's usually one or two. Even Chicago
even
has like
Chicago.
maybe 3 or 4 that are a little bit bigger, but not that many.
But those cities are so much bigger than Boston,
Yeah.
and the relative, so the point is that there are
Yeah.
more big institutions here that I'm not saying they should be siloed. I can understand more why they
Yeah.
are, because they, if you're the only game in town,
It's different,
you
yeah.
deal directly with the mayor's office, and
But
that's the way it is.
I think there's a ton of opportunity. I mean, I think of the universities, actually, what we sort of thought about when we had these super interesting conversations again and again and again was there's layers of how it would work, right? Like there's students. How do you get all the colleges to work together so that the students understand what is available to them from the cultural life of the city? I don't know if you get a like, welcome to Cultural Boston something when you come here as a student.
I think you do, don't
Maybe
you?
you do. Maybe your ID gets you into certain museums or certain things. I'm not sure. It's different among every different college. But what if it were the same?
Right,
Of like here is how you make the most of Cultural Boston. Here you go.
does make
Just
a lot
sort
of
of an easy package. There's students, there's faculty. Many creative people in Boston are employed by universities in Boston, right? So because academic jobs, where you teach 1 or 2 days a week, or you have a summer off, you have all these breaks, it helps support a creative practice on the side. It's pretty robust. It's very, very true. So you'll see there's like all these amazing playwrights and poets and artists in Boston who are sort of full-time faculty at many of our universities. That's amazing for Boston. But then there are also those, so the universities are like this ecosystem of students, faculty, but then also of places. And if you think about the university as provider of culture for the city of Boston, it's unbelievable, right? So there's like Harvard Art Museums and Emerson with their whole footprint in the theater district, and to a lesser degree Northeastern, but some, right? There's the open classroom, which if you go to the open classroom, the Myracraft open classroom, it's all sort of older people from Boston who are going to like kind of adult ed lectures. Like that's amazing. So there's a ton of that happening in Boston, which provides like an extra layer of just product and infrastructure for arts and culture in Boston. And without the universities doing all that, like it's, if you think of Wheelock College with their children's theater, that's one of the bigger children's theaters companies in Boston. Without Wheelock College there, it wouldn't be there, Yeah.
Any other questions from the students? Okay. Well, Julie, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, yeah.
Thank you.